I'm Khurram Hussain. I'm an economic writer. I write for Dawn newspaper, and I've been a business journalist in Pakistan for about little more than 10 years, about a decade and a half perhaps. And over that time period, I've seen that our economic language, I've noticed two things. One is that our economic language is dominated very heavily. And the second thing I've noticed is how little interest these indicators and this conversation actually commands among a wider audience, which is why you don't or you rarely ever hear good economic reporting or good economic analysis on television. It happens, but it's rare because the level of interest that this conversation elicits from the people is actually quite limited. And I've learned that there are good reasons why that's the case. Take, for example, some of the indicators that we talk about regularly: GDP, the current account deficit, the fiscal deficit, revenues. Revenues are a near obsession in this country, and it's economic discourse. The primary deficit, discount rate, the consumer price index, and so on and so forth. But over all this time period, one thing I noticed was that most people had little to no awareness of what these indicators really are, and more importantly, had little to no interest in finding out who really cares what the primary deficit is, for example. And yet we had our own finance minister, the former finance minister, Hafiz Sheikh, congratulating the country last December on having achieved a surplus in the primary account. We've had finance ministers in the past, not just in this government, but preceding ones too, congratulate the country on the improvement in the country's foreign exchange reserves position, or congratulating the country in having achieved a surplus in the current account. It's difficult to emphasize how far away from the awareness of the ordinary mass of citizenry these kinds of indicators are, these kind of congratulatory pronouncements are. So I'm going to center this discussion around one key question to open with, and I'll invite each one of my panelists to reflect on it. And the question is, to what extent do these indicators that dominate our economic discourse and our economic language over here describe and impact the world in which the mass of the citizenry lives? Are we, in fact, having a conversation among ourselves by focusing so much on these indicators alone? And are we excluding people, or is there a need for greater awareness and whatnot? So anyways, we've got Dr. Kaisar Bengali. He's needs no introduction really in most gatherings. He's an economist. He's worked for the Sindh and the Balochistan governments. He was a critical player in setting up the Benazir Income Support Program, and probably the first time this country committed itself to cash entitlements and income support for the poor to be given directly. We have Dr. Aisha Hos Pasha. She's an MNA, a former finance minister of Punjab, and has always been associated with academic research on policy and economics. And we have Dr. Ali Hasnain. He's the head of the Department of Economics here at LUMS, and much of his work focuses on law and economics and the intersections between those. So, Dr. Kaisar, I'd like to start with you, invite you to reflect your thoughts on the relationship between these indicators that we talk about all the time and the wider mass of the world in which the wider citizenry lives.
Asma Jahangir, with whom had some long association. And as I said in the morning session also, my last meeting with her was in Quetta, in the Serena Hotel, when I was working with the Chief Minister of Balochistan. We sat about 2.5 hours in the lobby of Serena, and what we talked about is she wanted to have a program in HRCP on economic rights. So I think it's very appropriate that we are in this session today. We've had two sessions on the economy, one we had in the morning and one now. Your question, yes, I think the people on the street, the households, families, they certainly do not discuss any of these issues. Although there has been so much mention in the media of growth rate that a lot of people are familiar with the term. Those who use it knowingly, policymakers, and there are many in government who use it frequently without knowing what it means. That's a personal experience. We have taken it blindly, that if the growth rate is high, everything is good. But what really matters is the composition of that growth rate. The growth rate is an average. Actually, it's an average of averages. So there are about, if you split the economy into different sectors, you can actually, sectors and subsectors, there are about 32. And the growth rate of each of the 32 then translates into the GDP by applying weights. That's technical stuff, but so there's an average. What I mean is, if there's a class, when I teach in a class, Aisha has also been teaching, Ali Hassan is also, we are all teachers, or I'm a temporarily ex-teacher. If you have a class of students who are 20-year-old, and I am teaching them, I am 70 years old. If you take an average, then the average age of the class will be somewhere around 30 maybe. But that will not reflect the reality of neither my age nor the student's age. So averages are misleading. You have to decompose that average to see what's happening. We've had 1 year where the growth rate was 9%. And it was said, this is stellar growth rate, we are becoming an Asian tiger, and so on and so forth. But that 9% was completely misleading, because what they did was that there are two things. One, they opened up the consumer market, consumer credit market. So everybody was buying cars and houses and so on and so forth. You could even take a loan for a vacation. So the banking sector boomed. Because of the interest income, suddenly they were taking, their portfolio increased. In fact, in 2 years, around 2004, 2005, 2006, the banking sector growth rate was 30 to 40% annually. That one average brought up the rest of the average, just like the 70-year-old teacher brings up the average of the whole class. So it was misleading. So it's the composition of that growth rate is very important. The commodity producing sectors is what matters, which is agriculture and industry. They produce the commodities. The trade and other sectors, transport, all depends on that. If commodity sectors are not doing well, the other sectors cannot do well unless you fudge the data, and that has been done a lot. Today, Pakistan, now, currently, in the last 20 years and increasingly over the last few years, wealth is being created in the speculative markets, stock market, property market, commodity market. And that does not create surplus for export, because what you need in these markets, if I am an operator here, all I need is 2-3 telephones, sit in my house, sip coffee, and manipulate markets and make a lot of money. I'm not creating jobs, and I'm not creating goods for export. So employment is not increasing, and exports are not increasing. In fact, it is amazing. Probably, I don't know, Khurram, we may be the only country in the world where our exports are standing where it was 10 years ago, 24, 25 billion. It's just not moving. So for the people, what really matters is jobs. What really matters is prices, so that their real income remains the same. Their purchasing power does not erode. That's what matters to them. And on top of that, they of course want to improve the quality of their life, so they need their real income, their purchasing power to increase. Purchasing power, if you don't have jobs, then even low inflation doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if things are cheap. You have no income, you can't even buy cheap stuff. So what's the use? So employment is number one. I think what matters to people is employment. There are two deficits, the budget deficit and the trade deficit. People don't talk about it, but in a way that determines how the economy functions. these are two wheels of a bicycle. If you have consistently high, very high expenditures over revenue, which right now it is 2 to 1, sort of, and you have very high imports over exports, which are also 2 to 1. For every $100 of export, we are importing $220 of imports. And it is consistent over the years, this gap, then you have to borrow to manage. And we've borrowed so much that now all the loans we take are for repaying past loans. We are not taking any loan now for building any infrastructure, any economic asset. It's just not happening. All of it is program loan, budgetary support. So these matter to the economy and to jobs and to inflation. We are facing inflation today, and if you trace it backwards to where it is, you will trace it to these two gaps. I'll end here, and we can talk about the rights issue.
That's a great place to pause,
yeah.
and we can come back to your thoughts from here. But let me move on with Dr. Aisha.
These days, there's a new narrative in the country that economic security and national security are interlinked, very closely intertwined. You can't have one without the other. And for me, when I'm saying national security, I really don't mean just the territorial security of Pakistan. For me, national security means the security and well-being of the people who live in Pakistan, the 207 million people, according to the 2017 census. How good an opportunity do they have to improve their lives and properties? How good an opportunities do they have for their kids to prosper and for them to improve their standard and quality of life? And do they have access to what they need to maintain a subsistence level of development level or not? Are very important questions. Now, when we are talking about, and these days the 8 o'clock talk shows and 7 o'clock talk shows are full of all the economic jargons. And let me also add, without offending anyone, half of the time people don't even know what they're really talking about, and there's big discussion. And maybe I can take the liberty of saying, particularly from the political representative side, that is now currently my constituency, though I'm proud of being a policy analyst and academic more so than that. See, why is it important? GDP, Kaisar has just indicated, it indicates how much income is being generated, how much you are earning, what is your purchasing power, what is your level of income that is prevailing, how much do you take home to provide for your family and to maintain a quality of life for yourself and your kids. It's important. But what is equally important, as he has emphasized, is that how is it distributed? Is growth taking place to make rich richer, or the poor poorer? Or do we have a situation in which growth is creating jobs, and growth is more broad-based and, like we call, more inclusive in nature? It's creating jobs. It's in the agricultural sector where the elasticity of employment, where a lot of people are employed. It's in a small-scale manufacturing sector where a lot of people are employed. If it's in export-oriented industry where a lot of people are employed, and so on and so forth. If that is the kind of a job, that is the kind of a growth which is job-creating and not jobless, then it penetrates and it affects positively all the quality of the life of all Pakistanis, more or less. But if not, if it's kind of a growth that we sometimes have seen in Pakistan as well, and is in the other countries, neighboring countries, then it doesn't penetrate, the trickle down doesn't take place, the expression goes. In the current account deficit, we have heard this so many times in these days. Current account surplus is taking place without realizing that it's just a flip for a month or two. It'll come back. The government comes on the television and says, we have generated current account surplus, and wow, we all clap. Something great has happened. It's temporary. Why? Why is it affecting the quality of lives of people? I think Pakistanis should know how is it exactly affecting their lives, more or less. See, If your current account is in deficit, that means that your demand for your dollars is more, or your expenditure of dollars is more than your income of dollars. This will directly lead to the decline in the value of Pakistani rupees. There will be depreciation. And we have talked about depreciation endlessly in this country without really seeing what's happening and why and where. So when it affects depreciation, why does it affect an ordinary man? Well, because whether you like it or not, we are a food importing country. And this is the catastrophe. One time cereal bread basket of the subcontinent is now importing wheat. It is now importing sugar. It is importing edible oil. These are consumption items of ordinary Pakistanis. And if you're importing them at a very high price, your rupee is low, has depreciated, then it will be passed on. Then petroleum, we import petroleum. Any hike in the cost of petroleum is passed on to ordinary Pakistanis. Then farmers, we import fertilizers. Any increase in fertilizer prices will be passed on to the farmers. So likewise in production, so many of our inputs are imported, even exports. Believe it or not, one of the reasons why exports do not increase so rapidly is that almost 40 to 50% of our imports are because they are inputs into our exports. So when inputs become very expensive, your exports become expensive, and it negates things. And there are many other areas which I can very quickly go through. Budget deficit, he's already elaborated. For me, budget deficit, if it increases, why Pakistanis will be affected is that 75% of your taxes, realistically speaking, effectively is indirect. It is borne by ordinary Pakistanis because it's indirect taxes. Even if it's income tax, it's of a withholding nature, which basically is indirect taxes. It's passed on to the consumers. So when you have deficits, government goes in for higher tax mobilization. What does it tax more? Indirect taxes. Look at what the IMF program is doing now. If we go ahead and accept what the IMF is saying to withdraw the sales tax exemptions and so on and so forth, 400 billion will be generated extra. How? Mostly through passing it on to ordinary Pakistanis in their consumption items. And also very importantly, the development expenditure goes down. And when development expenditure goes down, public sector projects shut down, and we have direct joblessness because of that, and secondly, indirect joblessness because the infrastructure breaks down and the private sector doesn't come in to put in money in Pakistan. Investments go down. There's no infrastructure, no investments from abroad. And of course, all of this leads to debt, and its inflationary effect is something which I think all Pakistanis by now really know, and we really need to be very clear on this, that the way the debt is increasing at this point. Dr. Bengali was just telling you, it's just we are not putting in borrowing for development anymore. Let me tell you, we are borrowing to run the government at this point of time. Or let me also tell you that we are borrowing to almost finance 40% of your defense expenditure. The only expenditure that our revenue generates, fully finances, is our debt servicing. Once we take care of that, which is interest payment and debt repayment, only 40% of defense, 60% of defense is financed through our own revenue generation. The rest of all that happens is through borrowing. So look at the situation we are in and see why would it not affect the ordinary Pakistanis, because we borrow, we bring inflation, we borrow externally, we are indebting ourselves, and we are going deeper into debt trap. And you Pakistanis, all of us are heavily indebted not only for this generation, but we are leaving a very big load for our future generations also.
Okay, many thanks.
I think I will stop here and we'll take the next question.
There's quite a lot you've just put on the table for us to work with. We've also been joined by Dr. Nadeem Haq. He's former Deputy Chairman, Planning Commission. Currently, he's heading the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics. He's joining us by Zoom. So, Nadeem, I'll come to you right after Dr. Ali Hasnain has had his say. He's the HOD of Economics at LUMS, and then we'll hear from Dr. Nadeem.
Thank you. So I think I'll take a slightly different take to this, and thank you, Khurram Saab, for posing a question that perhaps, when I reflect on what Asma Jahangir Sahiba meant to many of us, she was the champion of the poor and the weak. I never had the privilege of meeting her, but that's what she meant to me and for millions of others. And so to think about what is the impact that these indicators that we speak about and here in the TV on TV shows every night, what is the implication of these for the poor, and what is it that it misses out is an interesting conversation to have. So I'll put before you three things, and I've sort of brought some numbers to share with you. The first is that these numbers, pure economic indicators that we look at regularly, don't account for many real costs that society faces. And this is just bad. This is the bad practice of economics. It's not bad economics, because economics doesn't say pay attention to this cost, not to that cost. It's the bad practice of economics. So let me give you a few examples of this. The average Pakistani is losing 2.7 years of life expectancy because of smog. And Lahore has 5.3 years. All of us are losing 5 years of our lives because of this smog. That has to be accounted for in any decision-making, sensible decision-making that humans do. Deaths, and in the terms that economists are more familiar with, deaths and illnesses due to air pollution cost Pakistan 6.5% of GDP annually. And then water sanitation costs Pakistan $1 billion annually. The total economic cost of poor sanitation is about 4% of GDP. And those numbers manifest in more than 100,000 kids who die because of diarrhea and other water sanitation issues in this country. Now, any proper decision-making or policy planning in the country has to give a certain weight to these costs. And so that's the first thing that our economic indicators miss. The second is that government expenditures, so the government will state we spent 2.5%, 2.8% of GDP on health and education, which by the way is a third less than what India spends on both of those things. But what it doesn't take into account is the efficiency of expenditure. So I'll give you two examples of that. One is from my own research about 10 years ago, where we went and we surveyed 1/3 of all basic health units in Punjab. These are very basic clinics that are run by the government across Punjab, so about 2,500 or so of them. We surveyed 850, and we went and paid them surprise visits 3 or 4 times. On average, 1/3 of clinics didn't have a doctor posted. So the government has set up a building, and there's a chowkidar and someone to clean the place up and a dispenser, but no doctor. And that's a waste of government resources. 1/3 of clinics had a doctor posted and who was present, and 1/3 had a doctor who was posted and drawing a salary, but wasn't present at the clinic at a random time of visit. And their hours of opening for the clinics is just 8 to 2. So just 6 hours that you have to show up to work, and they're not there on a random visit. Now they might have run late that day, or they might have been called in to the central district office. But the bottom line is that civilians or citizens were not getting their services, and so this is a waste. In education, 45% of rural children going to rural schools in class 5 don't have the ability to read English, Urdu, or their regional language at the class 2 level. So why are we spending our money? Why are we wasting their time and our money on sending them to school? That's the other thing. And finally, what these aggregate accounts don't really explain well or don't illuminate is the impact of inequality. Inequality in Pakistan compared to many other places is not off the charts. It's not as bad as it could be. But there are many types of inequalities, such as, for example, when you look at education again, the bottom quintile or the bottom 20% of the population has only 32% of their children going to school, while 88% of households in the top 20% are sending kids to school. And that's going to have an impact on their outcomes and then ultimately on economic growth over the next few decades. I'll stop there, but we can continue.
Many thanks for that, Dr. Ali. That also inspires a number of very important questions. Now let's come to Dr. Nadeem Haq. Nadeem, the question we're addressing is the relationship between macroeconomic indicators and the lives of the mass of the citizenry. So in the intro, I gave an example of the kind of macroeconomic indicators that we talk about all the time in our economic discourse over here.
I heard that. No, I heard that.
You heard all that?
Yeah.
So just ask for your thoughts on these connections.
Well, let me begin by saying that, it's a very proud moment and an honor to participate in a conference in memory of Asma Jahangir. Truly an icon and a leader that Pakistan produced, one of our greats. And all of us wish she was here now. She would have really, really straightened out the horrible discourse that we have in this country. This is kind of very convenient to show off that we know something about the economy, but these numbers tell us very little about the economy, whether they're micro numbers or macro numbers. And I think we have to begin to step back and take a broader look. Then we rely on a lot of donor reports. Donors are really the leaders of our economic thoughts. And those reports tend to be very startling, very, headline grabbing, but really contain very little about Pakistan economy. I think, quite frankly, the biggest issue is that we have been forced to become a welfare economy. All the figures that everybody is talking about are welfare figures. We've made Asas far bigger than our, stage of development, and we want to give everybody a small amount of money. We built up an education system for welfare reasons, not for quality reasons, not for research. And the welfare system, education, is developing graduates that we've documented in PIDE are heavily underemployed or heavily unemployed. So in a sense, our education policy is not leading to anything. So the conclusion that we've come to at PIDE, and we're arranging a conference for that tomorrow, starting tomorrow in Peshawar, the conference is on opportunity. No economist, no book, I've looked at many books, ever discusses opportunity. We all discuss inequality and we all discuss ideas like, increased taxation, but the key issue here is opportunity. I have also interviewed and surveyed some youth in Pakistan. The thing that has to be noted, and this is where we need Asma Jahangir, that there is a deep dissatisfaction and a deep, I would even say, depression or something that is among youth. I've heard the term depression used by youth and their teachers. I've heard the term even suicide used by youth and teachers. There's a sense of hopelessness. For example, the word ambition doesn't enter the youth discourse. For example, the word more than a job doesn't enter the youth discourse. Entrepreneurship is only considered to be a fancy startup of a rich person, but a poor person's street vending operation is considered to be bad. It is in the way of the car. So we at PIDE have been fighting for street vending. And street vending is thought to be undesirable, dirty business, whereas a fancy startup is considered to be a great business. And the government is willing to subsidize the former, and the latter is taxed heavily. And the Supreme Court has even, in fact, Asma would have been here, it would have been great. The Supreme Court has banned street vending. I mean, this is amazing, calling it an encroachment. So the issue in this country is really that we have to begin to rearrange the dialogue. We have to begin to focus on opportunity. The second thing is we focus on taxation and documentation, and a huge amount of our dialogue, our diatribe, is about corruption. We are the only nation in the world that calls itself corrupt. I don't think our corruption is any more than Nigeria or Indonesia or India or many other countries. But yet our leaders come on the screen, our judges come on the screen, everybody around the world is talking about corruption. Corruption only exists in Pakistan. The result is, again, another thing we are measuring, the level of trust and the level of community in this society has dropped sharply. And at this level of trust in community, it is very hard to do business. It is very hard to make investments. And the government is deeply mistrustful and vice versa of the people. The government out to pin people down, extract resources from them. In fact, this is what we call in economics a predatory government. Ali Hasnan was right. There are so many assets that the government has created that are totally useless. I would even advocate to make the fund program work. We should cut down our development expenditures for the next 10 years to almost zero. We don't need development for the next 10 years because our development is totally misplaced. We're building more roads than we need. So there are so many things that are wrong, but the biggest problem is there is no ASMA in economics to lead the economic discussion, and we cannot have an economic discussion in the country, and we have tons of donors who are leading the discussion, who I would call economic hitmen. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks for that, Nadeem. The wrong investments we've been making because we are not making the investments in the betterment of or the improvement of the lives and the abilities of the population. So our health, education, healthcare, and nutrition, access to clean air quality, clean water. None of these areas, these have all lagged behind by way of investments, but we've perhaps overinvested in areas like, or unproductive investments on the one hand, such as military hardware, and on the other hand, in housing stocks that for the elites and for the rich, and perhaps infrastructure that the poor will never use. I'm always struck by how we have really plush and shining airports, but really decrepit railway lines and train stations. And it was particularly grievous to hear on TV, on the day of a massive train accident, the Minister Railways come on. This was in the morning, while they are pulling bodies out of that train. And he said that we know this train track has some problems, but we are not willing to spend the money to fix those problems because down the road, the Chinese are expected to come and upgrade the entire railway line, so we don't want to double up the expenditures. And he said this while the bodies were being pulled out. So if you can imagine an underinvestment in those things that the people use and an overinvestment in the things that the elites use, or that have no or little connection with the lives of the people. As a result of these making the wrong investments, it seems like we are stuck in a trap, which is causing us to spin our wheels faster and faster, the two wheels that Dr. Kesar talked about, and is driving us towards a situation that doesn't look good, right? I mean, Dr. Aisha actually painted a rather dire picture. We spend more money on debt servicing than we collect in revenues today. And it's driving up public debt as a result, which then feeds back into inflationary consequences, even less investments and whatnot. How do we break out of this loop? Dr. Nadeem says we can't do it without another ASMA in the economics profession. I hope that we are not far from having another ASMA in the economics profession. I think every profession needs an ASMA Jahangir, not just economics. But nevertheless, I do think that if proper heads are brought together, even without the great person's input, complex problems can be solved. So I don't want to present this as a despairing situation, but it is one that needs to be recognized and acknowledged. Are there any questions for our panelists? Okay, in a sense, we've got two questions here before us, right? One is, where are we going? Where are things headed right now? I'm not sure if you meant that question in the short term or the longer term, but we'll leave it for the panelists to understand that. And then about how do we get out of this situation? Do we really need another ASMA, or can it be done without the input of a great individual and a great leader and whatnot? Well, since you seem to have some thoughts on the matter, I invite you to start, and then we'll move to it.
Thank you for these actually good, very good questions. Because yes, we do sit here and and this is true that at this point of time, I'm a sitting member of the National Assembly. So why the disconnect? I'll tell you, one of my regrets sitting there is that we have politicized the economy in this country. And I see this as a catastrophe. When you start scoring political points on economics, wrong decision making of others, and come and make this exactly the same mistakes on yourself, then playing with words, then you are doing injustice to 207 million people you are representing. This is the catastrophe. What do we need? Well, I will be frank enough to tell you the reason why we haven't been able to provide the right answers is I will be blatant enough to say that here policy making in this country, not just policy making, but implementing policies, forces behind the policies are people with vested interests. We have elite capture. We are people who are thinking about the pie, the economic pie. We don't have people who are thinking about the size of the overall pie. When that starts happening, when vested interests start using policy tools and implementation to suit their own constituencies, their own vested interests, then we have what we see in Pakistan. And I'm not sitting here and just criticizing the politicians. The mess we have made with this country for 70 years is no one man's job. It's not just the politicians. It's the bureaucrats, it's the establishment, I'm sorry, it's the private sector as well, and everyone, I would turn around and say, have played their contribution in this. And what do we need to move forward? Well, if you realize that this is the mistake that we have made, what we need is for people to sit down, realize that they have played havoc with the economy of Pakistan. In the 60s, we were a role model. In the 200s, we are about to default every 2 years. And in the morning, we were talking about an IMF program on an average every 2 years, a crisis situation. So what is so fundamentally going wrong with what we are doing? We're all not sitting together and making the right policies. The bureaucrats are not implementing the right policies. The establishment is having its own role to play in those policy makings to suit itself. The private sector wants to take its money outside and not invest here adequately. And, well, we, the NGOs and think tanks, I was one of them, we also are not playing our role. We're not playing our roles because we are also not thinking about our own interests when we are saying this. We need a new social contract in this country. In the morning, Kesar was saying, let's have a, what was the expression you used? Bagawat. He was talking about Bagawat. I'm saying, let's all sit down together. And for the sake of the 207 million people, think कि हमारे interest बाद में, let's increase the size of the pie. And then we can have a bigger share in it. So we need to do that, and we haven't been able to do this. I regretfully admit where I went wrong, and I'm still not wrong. I'm not heard in the assembly. We have no forums, because this is not the political narrative these days.
Okay, many thanks for that, Dr. Aisha. Any of the other panelists care to weigh in on these questions?
Your question is which investment where we went wrong?
No, the question from the floor was.
No, I'm coming to that.
Okay.
But and Dr. Aisha also and Dr. Hasnain also said that we've been targeting wrong variables and so on and so forth. I don't think anything has been wrong. The economy is doing great. Everybody has opportunity. Everybody has good education, good housing. It all depends whose narrative are you talking about. There is a part of this country, the elite, the Shrafia, for whom everything is going great. They have excellent housing. They have more domestic servants in the house than members of the family. They don't need public transport. They can do everything on their own. They can buy land, they can build houses, they can set up their own schools, they can set up their own hospitals, and so on and so forth. They don't need anything. They don't need the state. And they've done very well. And this is where Pakistan has fallen into, that the state is just an onlooker. The purpose of the state is to extract money from the poor so that the rich can have a good life. So there's nothing wrong in this economy from their perspective. Future of the economy, if there's a vehicle without a driver going down the hill, and if you don't somehow stop that vehicle, it will continue going down the hill. We are going down the hill. Effectively, Pakistan is already bankrupt. As Dr. Aisha said, we are borrowing to pay back our loans, we are borrowing to pay our soldiers, we are borrowing to pay our civil servants. How else will you define bankruptcy? We are already a bankrupt nation. You can turn around. There is no problem without a solution. We have to cut down our non-development expenditure, transfer bulk of it into development expenditure, because land has been to be developed for housing, only the state can do that. Public education, only the state can do that. Public health, only the state can do that. Infrastructure for industry, only the state can do that. Infrastructure for agriculture, only the state can do that. Where will that money come from? It has to come out of non-development expenditure, and the biggest chunk of non-development expenditure is defense. Defense has to go. This whole narrative of security is just something that can no longer be justified. And okay, if I can concede, I will say I am not talking about combat expenditure because I don't know much about defense. I don't know which guns should we buy or which bullets to buy. But I am certainly competent to talk about non-combat expenditure. You drive from Lahore to Peshawar, and I've actually done it once. You will come across a cantonment on the national highway every 40 kilometers on average. And there are 3 cantonments which are 10 kilometers of each other. All these cantonments were built by the British when there was a danger of Tsarist Russia invasion from there. Now we have friendly regimes up to Moscow. You don't need any of these cantonments. Maybe out of 2 or 3, the rest have to go. Cut down that expenditure. Every country in the world has a coast guard which protects your coast during peacetime. Pakistan has a coast guard and a maritime security agency. 2 organizations doing the same job. I can go on and on, so many. So non-combat expenditure can be cut down to 80%, if not 0. There was recently a case of this club on the Rawal Lake or something which they had built. Only the swimming pool was 5 crore rupees. Why do you need that? In Lahore, there is an army museum when you go to the airport from here, I don't know how much it cost. I don't know how it has helped liberating Kashmir. I don't know how much it has helped protecting us from these bloody Indians or whatever. That has to go. That is where the problem is. The problem is there are 2 Pakistans. The Pakistan of the elite have a completely different vision of this country. They are very happy. There's nothing wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with this country. Everything is fine. Your literacy rate is 100%, infant mortality is 0, and so on and so forth. The rest are riffraff. They can take care of themselves. That has to change. We have to make one Pakistan.
Okay.
So, everything for everybody.
Many thanks, Dr. Kessel, for that as well. Well-earned applause. If there are, we do have time for one more round of questions. Well, we could ask. No.
Can you hear me?
it's not exactly the opposite, but Nadeem, would you care to weigh in on this conversation?
Gee, I was going to say something if you would allow me.
Yes, go right ahead. You have the floor.
Gigi, Khurram Sahab, my point when I was saying to have call it that economics does not have an asthma was not to say that we are talking about great people and others. Asma was not just a great woman. Asma was a great organizer and a great, she had an ability to bring people together and fashion narratives. I think we should not just think of her as an individual. She was represented the movement and the fashion. I think that's what we need in economics. In economics, there's far too little debate. Asma was capable of debating people, generating a consensus. We don't have that kind of thing. Everybody's talking at different cross purposes. As I keep saying, I don't think elite capture is a big issue. Elite capture happens everywhere in the world. I mean, US is elite capture, UK. Elite capture is a part of human narrative. It happens everywhere. The question is how to offer people opportunity. And it's not about giving them welfare, it's about giving them opportunity. We have made this a welfare state way before our time. We have created youth malaise. And as you can see, it does not interest our economists that this is happening. The youth psychology is not of interest to our economists. They want to give welfare. The key issue here is you're right about investments, but it's more than investments. The poor don't need investments. The poor don't need welfare. They need opportunity. And I'll give you a case in point, very simple. In order to improve their welfare, poverty has dropped in this country, dropped substantially. The middle class has increased in this country. PID has an analysis on that. Middle class has increased substantially in this country. Things have happened well for the people.
Nadeem,
The
Nadeem,
reason
let me
is,
just stop you here and ask you a quick question.
no,
If
can
you
I just
look
finish the thought?
If you look at the rates of child stunting in this country, look at the rates of number of children who die before the age of 1. If you look at the indicators on maternal health in this country, if you look at the numbers of out-of-school children that this country produces, how on earth is that not the result of underinvestment in people's welfare and in people's well-being? Pakistan has some of the worst indicators in each one of these areas that I'm talking about.
Okay, great.
I mean, what's the point of giving somebody an opportunity when they can't even reach the age of 1 because the water in their district is contaminated? What kind of opportunities are you going to create for that individual if you're not going to invest in providing them with the clean water so they can at least reach the age of 1 and then start going to school at the age of 5 and get the right nutrition so their cognitive abilities have not been stunted due to malnutrition?
Are you done?
Yeah, I'm done. I mean, my question is
If you
between
think,
investment
if you
and
think I
opportunities.
have the right to reply, I'll reply. Otherwise, if you have made up your mind, then fine.
Asking you, so go right ahead, please.
Okay, my point is, everybody seems to have made up their mind because they heard some narrative from a donor, right? That, okay, this indicator, that indicator, so fine, I don't dispute those indicators at all. But Khurram, what about the thousands? You know, there was a job advertisement for a chaprasi. 75,000 people applied, and many of them were
someone who has
sorry.
served donors all his career to accuse us of our narrative coming from a donor is very amusing.
Okay. Well, I guess, Khurram, we can't have a conversation. See what I mean? This is not a conversation. You were supposed to moderate something. We were supposed to have a discussion. We don't want these silly ad hominems from people who don't even understand good economics, who just go around talking about God knows what. So I'm sorry. I think I'll call it a
Nadeem,
halt.
I'm
Thank
really
you.
sorry that this took a sour note, but in any case, we're also approaching the end of our time. If there are any more questions from the floor, I'd be very keen to take them on. Ali, if you wish to also weigh in on some of the questions that came from the floor.
I would, please. Thank you. So I think one of the things that Nadeem Saab mentioned, I don't know if he's still here, was street vendors and the fact that they require opportunity. And I think what we've had missing in this country is establishing property rights. Let's say that you have vendors who are on the road. In practice, the government won't do much about it most of the time, except when there's a drive to get rid of them. If we are to tolerate, as regulators, if we live in a world that already tolerates economic activity, then I think one way that the country can move forward is to start regulating and issuing property rights for them to show up and set up that stall. In the same way, we have settlements where people haven't had land rights, and to establish those property rights and to give them title to that land would be a way to unlock economic activity. We didn't get to it in the time that we had, but a fundamental need for Pakistan to really progress is to establish good property rights and contract enforcement. Without contract enforcement, no sophisticated economy can flourish. And in this country, until recently, I believe, the number of court cases has been greater than the number of tax filers. So without establishing the rule of law, you will not have your economy cannot progress without establishing rule of law. And therein lie many of the answers to what we face today. And this can go on to thinking about even just sort of something like the Fiscal Responsibility and Debt Limitation Act. Right? We put a law in place that said, here are bars we'll have to the amount of debt that we'll take. When government after government exceeded that limit, there's been no implementation of that law. You either repeal the law or you live within it. But in Pakistan, we live in a situation where neither happens. So I think one place where the themes of economists ally with the themes of lawyers is the establishment of rule of law. And I think that would help every citizen, really.
That's a great point to start, no doubt, in building greater synergies between the kind of struggles that need to be waged in the economy, the kind of struggles that are being waged on the human rights front. For my part, I'll just share a concluding thought that I don't think the human rights community does itself any favors by staying away from the economic language and the economic conversation in the country. Whatever rights your struggle brings to the people, the economy can easily deprive them of the ability to enjoy those rights through material deprivation in their circumstances. And sometimes the vice versa can also be true, that somebody who's struggling to put food on the table for his or her family is less likely to worry about the state of his or her rights and more worried about where the next meal may come from. There are very powerful connections between both these struggles, and I hope there'll be further opportunities to explore those connections. Thank you all for attending, and my special thanks to all members of the panel, including Nadeem, for having participated in this discussion.